The Stone Age, Introduction and Overview, Divergence and Development. You ought to know by the end of this the major human ancestors and why they're important, where we came from and how we know, how are we the same as these early ancestors, and how are we different. A brief timeline. The first human ancestors emerged circa 5 million years ago. 50,000 years ago, all modern humans still lived in Africa. 15,000 years ago, we were nomadic travelers who left no records other than art. Put another way, written records exist for only the last 10% of human history. This section covers the early 90% very, very quickly. In other words, for most of human history, all we have are a few pieces of bone, crude stone tools, and DNA. This is where history, science, and math intersect. For example, we know that clothing likely began around 70,000 years ago. This is because in humans, head lice and body lice are different species, and we can calculate when they developed thanks to math and DNA. If you have questions about this, it's sort of more interesting than actual stuff I expect you to know. Please ask me in class and I can explain in more detail. Some basic facts. Chimpanzees are between 98 and 99% identical to us. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down unchanged from our mothers, and men's Y chromosome is passed down unchanged from their father. Similar to the last one, if this is confusing, you're like, why do we need to know this? Please ask me. The basic gist of this is we looked modern about 100,000 years ago before we began to act modern 50,000 years ago. Divergence, neither the novel nor the movie. About 5 million years ago, a cooling climate prompted a dramatic change, or split, amongst our ancestors. Specifically, due to the cooling climate, there were fewer and fewer pretty green forests, like so, and more grassy plains called savannas, like here. This is what we mean by, quote, natural selection from Charles Darwin. That nature selected for a trait given that there were more grasslands available, people who could exploit or use the grasslands, not the forest, had an advantage. In other words, it was luck that our ancestors happened to be adapted for the grasslands, not fitness or the fact that they were better. Specifically, the adaptation, the thing that they had that allowed them to go out on the grassy savannas, was bipedalism. This is from the Latin, and it means quite literally 2 feet, bi meaning two and ped meaning foot. And the first ancestor we know of to practice bipedalism is known as Australopithecus, shown here in the pretty skull on the right. Walking on 2 feet has a few notable benefits. It frees your hands. For what? We will see on the next slide. And it is especially more efficient, especially traveling on the ground, not through the trees. For the same amount of calories, a chimp can travel 6 miles on the ground, but we can walk 11. And here on the left is archaeological evidence of fossilized footprints from East Africa from early Australopithecus. Again, walking on 2 feet is not only more efficient, it frees our hands for tools. The first documented tool user we know is also the first member of our genus, the genus Homo. He's called Homo habilis, and his name literally means handy man. They emerged 2.5 million years ago during another cool, dry climate in the history of the Earth. And they're the first, again, documented tool use. There may have been some wooden or stick tools for Australopithecus, but those have not survived. We know that Homo habilis used stone tools. This allowed them to chop up bones and meat, and allowed them to eat meat, contributing to a larger brain size, which allowed them, of course, to make better tools as well. This is because our brain, while only 3% of our weight, uses 20% of our energy. This is why, if you do not eat breakfast, you feel tired and sleepy and cannot think in the morning, unless you drink coffee. These crude stone tools, similar to the stone choppers here on the right, were in existence for 800,000 years. So they have tools, but they're crude. You can see sort of a rough cutting edge here and here. But They're not great tools, and they stay around for a very long time until our next crucial ancestor, Homo ergaster or Homo erectus. Either name is acceptable, often used interchangeably, because right now we're not really sure if there are two names for one species or if they're related or if they're connected or what. They had more complex tools similar to the hand axe shown here, more cutting edges, harder to shape and use, but also better. This meant that they were also probably cooking their food, and this allows it to be chewed and digested more easily, and therefore it gives you more energy more efficiently. It's easier to eat cooked food than raw food, and it's not as hard on your teeth either. We also have evidence from the size of children's heads and the size of the hips of their mothers that they probably were helping each other through childbirth, and this is evidence to some extent of society or culture that they're helping each other out through childbirth. Because quite simply, as their brains get bigger, kids' heads are too big to be born easily, and so mothers need help. This is also the first species that we know who left Africa, because these types of hand axes and tools are found across Eurasia. That's from Europe to Asia, so we know that they were across the entire expanse, Africa, Europe, and Asia. Meanwhile, as they spread out, some Homo ergaster erectus stay in Africa, and they develop into anatomically modern humans, known by their Latin name of Homo sapiens, which means thinking man. This is us. They developed around 200 to 100,000 years ago, but we know they remained in Africa until about 50,000 years ago. And we are, all of us in the world, descended from this small group of about 5,000 people in East Africa in an area the size of Rhode Island. It seems likely that only a small group of this small group, about 150 people, actually left Africa and spread out and formed the basis of all 7 billion people in the world today. What we mean by anatomically modern as opposed to behaviorally modern is that these people had the anatomy of us. Their bones, their bodies would have looked like us. I mean, hairier and possibly uglier, but they would have been indistinguishable from modern humans. But they didn't behave like us. In other words, we looked like humans before we acted like humans. About 50,000 years ago, that is when there's evidence of behavior that we recognize as modern. More complex tools, spear points, arrowheads, and other smaller, more detailed implements. The development of art, cave paintings, and other things of that sort. Ritual, which can be evidenced through birth and death, and burial sites and necklaces, as well as the existence of trade. Language. Monkeys today spend about 20% of their time grooming each other, and this seems a way of sort of making friendships and alliances and forming the basis of their society and their tribes and their groups. Possibly not coincidentally, we spend 20% of our time in conversation. In other words, we don't groom each other anymore, or I guess some of you do like to do each other's hair, but we instead have our bonds in society and friendships formed through conversation. As a point of interest here as to the importance of conversation and how chancy it was to develop language, changing one letter in our DNA from a guanine to an adenine on one small gene on only one chromosome severely limits human speech. These early humans, it seems clear, ate as modern foragers, hunting and gathering food. We will talk more about this. The best example we have is drawn from other modern groups who spend about 12 to 21 hours a week gathering food and hunting for it, and about 40 to 44 hours total working. That means making housing and implements and clothing. In other words, we probably work more hours per week than our ancient ancestors hunting and gathering did. We will talk more about this in our next unit. Was this a peaceful time? People had often thought that, our ancestors were simple and primitive and calm and peaceful people. This seems likely not to be true. Many modern nomadic hunter-gatherer groups move pretty quickly to violence. They go from talking to fighting to deadly combat and fighting relatively quickly. Talking, usually according to modern anthropologists, split into 3 different progressions from argument, and that can escalate into verbal anger and then into personal sexual insults. And if you've seen any teenage boys in action, you can imagine this sequence of events. It seems likely to be shared in part of our DNA dating back to our ancient ancestors as well. We know that there first emerged permanent settlements, no matter nomadic and traveling around, but actual small towns and villages about 15,000 years ago, and it seems that dogs were domesticated at this same time. Dogs seem to be very helpful to guard against intruders, to bark, to warn us of invaders, though if dogs came and saw an easy source of food and started hanging around, or if we actually actively domesticated them from wolves, is a matter of some debate. We know that the last ice age ended about 12,000 years ago, and with the end of this ice age ushered in a dramatic revolution in human history, which we will talk about next. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.